Hi, everyone. I'm here today because I really love supernatural horror fiction. I always have. Even as a kid, I really loved spooky stories. I mean, look at this. I never wanted to be anything nice or pretty for Halloween. No princess, no superhero. I drove my poor mother to distraction. But I'm not alone. A lot of us love supernatural horror fiction. For many of us, it's because of the jump scares it delivers. My colleague Angus Fletcher, whom you're going to hear from a little bit later this afternoon, proposed in a recent book that the reason we enjoy being frightened by horror fiction is that it provides the same pleasurable flood of adrenaline and cortisol as a bungee jump does. In other words, we're getting all the biochemical fun of being pursued by a monster with none of the actual risk. I think Angus is right about this, but this afternoon I'm going to propose that there's an additional reason that a lot of us enjoy supernatural horror fiction. Namely, it invites us to think about questions that we would normally call religious, such as whether there's something very powerful out there that's watching everything we do. Religion is a profoundly human impulse. It's been around as long as our species has. Even people who don't think much about religion in their daily lives can find it fascinating to wonder, why does evil exist? Will good eventually conquer evil? And most importantly of all, what's going to happen to me when I die? Will I go to heaven? Will I become a ghost unhappily wandering the earth, or maybe something even worse? Now, some supernatural horror fiction engages with religion in a very obvious way and sends a very direct message. This film, for example, The Nun, pretty much screams, "Christianity fights evil." That's not the kind of thing that interests me, because when the message is that blunt, you can either agree with it or disagree with it. The story's not going to intrigue you. It's not going to entice you into thinking about religion in a more discriminating way. What interests me is supernatural horror fiction that engages with religion in a very nuanced way. So nuanced that you usually don't even know it's happening. It does this by means of subtle cues. What I'm talking about is sort of like subliminal advertising, but with a very important difference. In subliminal advertising, you're driven to do one particular thing, such as buy a certain brand of soft drink. These cues that I'm talking about, they prime you to look at the story through a kind of religious lens, but they don't force you to do that, nor do they dictate how you're going to interpret what you see through that lens. They leave the conclusions to you, which, of course, makes the conclusions all the more powerful. This is a new thing, historically speaking. Now, in and of itself, combining supernatural horror with religion, that's as old as storytelling. But for millennia, the messages were just as straightforward as the one in The Nun. Stuff like, do what the gods are telling you to do, or else they will send this horrible demon against you. It was in the mid-1800s, a time when the Western world was beginning to reconsider its relationship to established religion, and a time as well when the new genre of supernatural horror fiction was taking shape, that some literary authors, such as Charles Dickens, began to experiment with new ways of putting religion into their stories. Other authors followed suit. By the end of the 1800s, you've got Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, believe it or not, has a lot of religion. Go read it if you don't believe me. And in just a few moments, I'm going to show you some examples of these cues from two of Mike Flanagan's recent, critically acclaimed series for Netflix. Nowadays, you might almost say that Americans get as much of their religion through supernatural horror fiction as they do from houses of worship. So these are the two Flanagan series that I'm going to be looking at today, The Haunting of Hill House and The Haunting of Bly Manor. Before I get going on that, I need to warn you of something. What I'm about to embark upon is going to be a little bit like killing a butterfly and pinning it to a piece of cardboard so that you can look at it more closely, and explaining to you that the cues are there, I'm going to pretty much ruin all of the subtlety of the cues. I'm also going to end up telling you how I interpreted what I saw when those cues primed me to look through that lens of religion. You might have seen something very different, or you might have seen what I saw but interpreted it differently. In The Haunting of Hill House, the Crane family moves into an old house and is attacked by its ghosts. The story moves back and forth across about 30 years. We see the Crane children being attacked by the ghosts in Hill House, and we see the Crane children as adults, still struggling with the after effects of those ghostly attacks. Most of the cues to think about religion in this story come through two secondary characters, Mr. and Mrs. Dudley, who are the caretaker and the housekeeper of Hill House. Both of them mention their Christian faith in passing during early episodes. In episode 9, during a flashback to about a month after the Crane family has moved into Hill House, Mrs. Dudley and Mrs. Crane fall into discussing the best ways of protecting their children from the dangers of the world. When the scene opens, Mrs. Dudley has just entered the room where Mrs. Crane is seated. She pauses next to the statue of an angel for about 20 seconds. Notice that the position of Mrs. Dudley's arms and the position of the angel's arms are very similar. This begins to cue us to equate the two. Notice also the stained glass windows in the background, which subtly confer the idea of being in a church. Now, after standing here for about 20 seconds, Mrs. Dudley moves here. She actually assumes the angel's wings, and for about 10 seconds, she is an angel herself. So these cues, the cue of what happens with the angel statue and the cue of the stained glass windows, primed me to look through that lens of religion and understand everything that Mrs. Dudley was saying to Mrs. Crane about how to best protect children as a sort of message from God. Now, in a later part of the scene, Mrs. Dudley moves to the other side of the room, which is crammed with statues of the Greek gods, including one that is holding a trident that looks a lot like the devil's pitchfork. Notice that in this frame, and off and on throughout this part of the scene, Mrs. Dudley is looking not at Mrs. Crane, but at that statue, which draws our eye to it as well and makes sure that we see it. And of course, notice that convenient diagonal ceiling beam, which is also helping to guarantee that we notice the statue. So if the first part of the scene primed me to understand everything that Mrs. Dudley was saying about how best to protect children as a sort of message from God, this part of the scene primed me to open that interpretation up more broadly and understand the women's discussion about how to protect children as part of a much larger, ongoing battle between the spiritual powers of good and the spiritual powers of evil. In The Haunting of Bly Manor, two children are possessed by ghosts and must be rescued by the adults who love them, including the housekeeper, Mrs. Gross, who always wears a cross around her neck, is frequently found in the chapel lighting candles, and who in the opening credits is shown devoutly praying. These cues prime each of us to understand everything that Mrs. Gross does, and also everything that she doesn't do, in the light of whatever picture of Christianity we ourselves have acquired in the course of our lives. Several important conversations take place in that chapel between Mrs. Gross and other characters. In episode 1, the governess Danny approaches Mrs. Gross in the chapel to ask for her advice about strange dolls that the little girl has been making. Mrs. Gross's reply to Danny makes it very clear that she loves the children deeply. That, combined with the fact that this conversation was set in the chapel, primed me to expect that however it was that the children would be rescued, it would have to do in one way or another with Mrs. Gross's faith in God. In episode 5, in a flashback, there's a conversation between Mrs. Gross and the children's mother The two women are commiserating about the fact that they need to maintain blind faith in their husbands, whom they have not seen for quite a while. At one point, the mother says, maybe having blind faith in our husbands is like having blind faith in God, because we can't see God either. And then she goes on to muse, I wonder, how long can someone have faith in someone they can't see? Immediately after that flashback, there's a second flashback to a conversation, again in the chapel, between Mrs. Gross and the former governess, Rebecca. They, too, are commiserating about the difficulty of maintaining faith in those who claim to love them. Is blind faith adequate, they wonder? Can it be dangerous? Can faith lead you astray? And at what point should you give up on faith and take matters into your own hands? So the fact that these conversations were set in the chapel, and the fact that the mother mentioned God in one of them, primed me to revisit the conclusion I had reached in episode 1 about Mrs. Gross's faith having something to do with the rescue of the children, and conclude instead that Mrs. Gross's faith in God had immobilized her, had prevented her from doing things that could help the children when she had the chance. So today I've shown you just a few of the cues that occur in these two Netflix series. I am not trying to convince you that Mike Flanagan meant us to understand Mrs. Dudley as the messenger of God, or meant us to understand Mrs. Gross's faith as having immobilized her. Those were the conclusions that I came to when the cues primed me to look through that lens of religion. What I am trying to convince you of is that the cues are there, both in these two series, in some of Mike Flanagan's other series, in many books by Stephen King, in other films, you name it. The cues are there, waiting to prime each of us to look through that lens. So, the next time you decide to indulge your taste in supernatural horror fiction, remember, you may end up thinking about God as well as ghosts. Thank you.